it gets driven on by, just, I can be in Chicago in 5 hours. I can be in London in 13 hours. I can be in Australia in 19 hours, right? I mean, so you're breaking down all of the barriers, the walls that existed before that kept language, to itself.
And you can talk to someone right now across the world.
Yeah, exactly. And then it happens to be that Indo-European owns that system. Mm-hmm. So now we're all being brainwashed, if I use that word, into Indo-European thinking and processing. Now, what if the Chinese owned the internet, or what if an African language owned the internet? Well, exactly. But the same, my point is that then now we're molding the rest of the world after ourselves.
And what we're doing, even with our app that came out, and what we're trying to do with these classes, is to standardize ours,
right?
So that we can have a common ground.
Absolutely.
Where we communicate with each other in Dee-ni.
Right, because what happened in the past, what existed in the past, were dialects of Dee-ni itself. I mean, for example, we used to have great arguments about this, we would observe these arguments as the youth, the children, between the speakers. Because we had dialects here, okay? And so what a dialect is, they come from the same language, but in the same community or region. So in North America, we know about the Southern drawl, right? That's a dialect. See, y'all, come back now, you here, put your dinner, you hungry, or whatever they say. That's a dialect of English. That's not Japanese, and we call it substandard, right? And they call us substandard. You know what I mean? So then the argument starts. See, no, you guys talk all weird out there on the West Coast, and we're dialect C. California's dialect C. Okay.
You get the Indian twang.
The New York and those guys have their own one, and then the rich people from up on the East Coast up there, they all have their own little dialect that they speak, like Martha Stewart's dialect.
Yeah.
Those Connecticut people, whatever. So those are dialects. So they're not language families. They're very different. Now even here in Dee-ni, in the old grade book, the first one that we put out back years ago, there's a little chart in here to try to deal with that. There's a little chart in here to try to show us
the differences, or
the little subtle differences. Because it was such a big deal at that time. Because at the time we were dealing with fluent speakers, right? And they represented their speech communities that they grew up in, that they spoke a lot with.
First language.
Their first language. So therefore it was a big discussion. And they would end up, okay, variances in enunciation, page 13. Okay, so for example, there is an ow, ah difference. So ak Dee-ni versus ak Dee-ni. Moinhu versus monhu. So daila versus dilla. So cha-ge-lat versus cha-ge-lit. Num-ni-ta versus num-ning-ta. Dialect versus dalet. Hai-nas, hai-nas. He-chewy.
He-chewy?
He-chewy. He-chewy. This I've heard a lot in the 1950 recordings of Ed Lopez. He-chewy, then-chewy, you-chewy, they put the ooey on there, But so these are how our dialects start or exist, and then if that community doesn't have a lot of exchange over time, it standardizes, and it will eventually become another daughter language. It will not become Algonquin, it will not become Penutian, it will not become Russian. It will become another daughter language eventually in time from the matrix language.
Like we'll understand it, they'll just sound funny to
us.
Wherever you're from.
And now if they live away far enough, long enough, it'll get to where you don't understand it. So at first they're going to be mutually intelligible. Oh yeah, you're from Crescent City, and I'm from Commonwealth, or you're from Rogue River, But in time,
let's make babies.
Oh my God, you're from Hoopa. You guys have this really weird twang going on in Hoopa, or whatever, and then you get on the Navajos to kind of go, where's that yin sound in there, or whatever, because it actually becomes no longer mutually intelligible. So in that map that we handed out that you got last time, that map shows you that this part of the world was a mutually intelligible language from the Applegate River down the Rogue River clear up to
Sixes.
Sixes or Flourish Creek. Yeah, this is kind of the map on the front. So that means this territory was a mutually intelligible speech community. These people could go see these people, know these people. They could all come to the World Renewal Ceremony on Taka in December and all understand each other, but immediately know where you were from. That's a dialect.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's probably how you talk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh,
Well,
yeah.
and the other thing too that we learned in a language class years ago is that there's different classes of speaking.
Right. Register.
Registered, different ways that you speak at ceremony, way you speak everyday language, and also what village you came from actually, how you spoke, and it had to do with social status, how wealthy you were, how educated you were, so to speak, because you had people who were of the higher class kind of work that people did. And so people spoke accordingly.
So that's register, and we have register in English, right? We can tell when somebody's got a higher register of speech versus a person who doesn't. You just can,
The vocabulary.
You know, yeah, their vocabulary, the way they choose to describe the world around them, you know their register, okay? And then I just want to, so I'm just putting that, don't forget this, so dialect and daughter, so dialect is of the same language, right? And the daughter language becomes a separate, non-intelligible language. Now in that dialect, you're going to have register. So what happens in our case, what happens with the Dee-ni, is that after, you know, all the changes that occurred and all the history that we don't need to get into today, because we all been through this, we had a candlelight vigil for that, okay? But what happened then is as the speech communities began to erode and or were shoved together. So once Smith River Rancheria was purchased in 1906, and Valley Rancheria was purchased in 1906, then the Dee-ni people started moving on to it. It was first, I think that was maybe the second time we became reservation Indians. So actually it's probably the first time, because the first reservation was earlier, but people didn't move there. But anyway, so then our speech committee was shoved together. So you had your Mixtecton speakers, you had your Taatan speakers, you had your Hollandput speakers, you had your Sixes River speakers, you had all shoved together now, kind of in this little island called Smith River Rancheria, you know. And so you can imagine what was going on. They're all mission intelligible, but little differences, you know. And there was nitpicking that was started over it or whatever. And we grew up hearing the nitpicking, and they were never huge things like Gossi for a plate and Gossai.
Yeah.
You know, really? Oh, you know, as the kids were kind of going, well, we say Gossi, I'm sorry. You know what I mean? That's just the way it is, you know, and it's no big deal. So we finally learned to deal with that. But what Cheryl's point was is that now we're standardizing Dee-ni ourselves and losing a little bit.
Register.
Well, not the register, because now register has to do with knowledge use.
Level.
Level of language and how you use the language.
Like in prayer,
That's register.
things like that.
You know, like if I said to you, today we're going to study the morphosyntactic and morphological inflectional morphology of the Dee-ni vocabulary. You would say,
Sound like that.
Oh,
what do you say? We're going to study the sound structure.
Please dumb it down for us.
Yes.
Really? Yeah.
We're not going to say. We're going to say the sound structure,
Dee-ni
the
for
word
dummies.
ordered sentences.
The word
you know.
order.
Then, I got you. But that's part of speech register. It's not the whole thing, but it's usually by specific
That's an
use.
example.
And the
Yeah,
other,
so that's register.
the other thing I want to say about that when we were in our language classes with our elders, people came from different village areas. And so you would hear, oh no, that's Tatutni. Oh no, that's Talawa. That's Chetco. They would say Chichu, whatever. And you know, so we had those things going on in our classes over the years. And I think back now when I look at some of the other reservations here in the Pacific Northwest, you know, that all the tribes that got confederated and they were just smashed together and had to live coexistently and with their languages, and how they had to go more American Indianism to a certain extent, with the influence coming from the Great Basin region and whatever all, you know, because there were just
Well, they're cultural specifically.
and when you look at historically what happened, and so for us to be more homogenous, so to speak, because at least we had the same the same
the language.
but different
And different dialects.
And that
Definitely not different daughter languages.
yeah, and that made it a lot easier.
Because like over here, daughter would be like Hoopa or Navajo. See, those are daughter
Apache.
languages. say, of each other. Well, this is a dialect, we're talking about the dialect though,
Yeah.
here now.
Wailaki, Apache.
Wailaki, Apache, oh yeah, there's, Koyukon, the Chon, all those different languages, exactly.
And if probably the Yurok who were shipped here and put on Reservation Ranch had survived and weren't murdered, we would have had that contention.
Influence?
Well,
But they were wiped out and never sent
But
home.
we ought too.
That's what I'm saying, no.
The Algonquin, yeah.
Oh, you said Yurok.
Oh,
Yeah, you meant
Oh, it's the same
I
thing.
meant to
That's
say
the same
Algonquin.
thing.
Anyway, so the point is that all I just want to share is that just to get your minds wrapped around the idea of what those different terms mean and why and how you discuss them and describe them in language about the the mother language, daughter language, and of course register is its own thing. I mean, it's within the language. Now there have been arguments by linguists that if a small community of speakers exists, that there can be no register, and I just disagree with that because they believe register comes from mass populations where there are economic stratification, where there's military might. So if you go to the control or limitation, so like what was that? The Forbidden City, in China. Only a certain type of people got to go to the forbidden inner city, right? And all the poor paupers or whatever, whoever they are, the slaves, whoever, lived outside the walls. So they speak the lower register, and those in the inner city speak the upper register.
It's like Hunger Games.
Yeah, kind of thing, exactly. And so they're saying that the Dee-ni could not have had register because there's too few of us.
Oh, really?
Of course, I don't agree
Well, I
with
think
that.
historically we had numbers, but
Oh, yeah, when we were in
after
there-
Holocaust, and so those remnants that survived the Holocaust
Still
were
survived
the language that they carried forward. I mean, so it had to be, when you have all these populations wiped out, you're gonna have what's left.
Yeah, we went from 10,000 speakers down to 2,000 speakers,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then after that, the language, of course, was then extracted,
Systematically.
systematically by the United States government and society. But anyway, so what I've come to understand about register and Dee-ni is really having complete inflectional ability.
Word inflectional.
You would like it.
So, if you have complete inflectional ability in the language, that really raises your register. So inflectional means to be able to know the various forms of a verb. Okay, all the persons.
I want to be inflexible.
I'm cutting, you're cutting, they're cutting, we're cutting, it's being cut. Okay, all those inflectional abilities. And then that's just for person. And then there's also these adverbials, which mean how. So cut up, cut apart, by just adding these morphemes on there. So the older you become and the more language you learn, just like we do with the English language, when we were in kindergarten, we spoke a certain register. And by the time we got to high school, we spoke hopefully a different one. And then, hopefully it's not just gaga googa, well, except for at night, I'm just but anyway, so inflectional ability. What I noticed in Dee-ni is that there are people who would say, "Oh, I don't speak high-class language." Well, what they were saying, I could observe because I'm like trying to learn this and figure it out. Was really is that they would put things together to describe things differently. Like instead of taking the verb and pulling it apart in your head and then put the stuff in it and then slam it back together and say it, they would just take different elements.